Let's start with a thought experiment. Imagine a single microscopic cell dividing into two, then four, then eight. If that microorganism reproduced without any environmental restrictions whatsoever, its offspring would rapidly multiply until they eventually outweigh the entire planet. This chart illustrates the exponential growth model. It tracks population size over time, creating a dramatic J-curve that shoots nearly straight up. It shows why unchecked reproduction creates a mathematically devastating trajectory for any habitat. Now, apply this curve to a biological population, which ecologists define as a specific group of interacting organisms of the same species that share a common gene pool in a specific area. If they keep interbreeding with endless resources, that curve never stops. But if you look outside, the Earth hasn't been overrun by a single species of bacteria or beetle. Since that mathematically guaranteed doom hasn't happened, there must be invisible ecological forces actively keeping these reproducing populations from achieving their infinite potential. To figure out exactly what those forces are, ecologists first have to measure the size of the population they're studying. But manually counting every single individual of a highly prolific invasive species, like these clustered zebra mussels, is a logistical impossibility. Instead, researchers rely on sampling techniques. For stationary plants or slow-moving organisms, they use a quadrat. By isolating a defined small area and counting what's inside the grid, they can calculate an average and estimate the total size of a much larger population. For wider ecological zones, they stretch out long measuring tapes called transect lines. And for highly mobile aquatic animals that won't stay put, researchers use a mark and recapture method, catching a few, marking them, releasing them, and seeing how many marked individuals they catch the next time around. These sampling tools give ecologists a vital metric, population density, or the number of individuals per unit of area. Tracking how that density fluctuates over time serves as the baseline for determining whether an ecosystem is stable, growing, or declining. A high-density number alone doesn't tell the whole story. Ecologists also look at population dispersion, which is the characteristic pattern of physical spacing between individuals within a habitat. And that spacing is rarely an accident. The most common pattern is clumped dispersion. This occurs when resources like water or nutrient-rich soil are patchy and unevenly distributed, causing animals or plants to group tightly together in specific viable zones. Contrast that with uniform dispersion. When a vital resource is incredibly scarce, intense competition forces organisms to physically distance themselves from one another, resulting in an evenly spaced, almost grid-like arrangement. These spatial patterns, whether clumped, uniform, or random, serve as a visible map of environmental pressure. They show exactly how the physical limits of a habitat define where life can and cannot exist. Look at what happens to our chart when we track real populations over time. That aggressive exponential J-curve inevitably bends, flattening out horizontally to form a realistic logistic model known as an S-curve. The mathematical line bends because of limiting factors. These are specific environmental forces, both living and non-living, that physically push back against reproduction and survival. Biologists divide these into two categories. First are density-independent limiting factors. These are erratic, unpredictable forces, like a sudden freeze, an extreme drought, or a flash flood. They sweep through a habitat and kill organisms regardless of how crowded or sparse it is. Take the century plant, which only seeds after a rare, heavy rainfall. While a drought limits their growth, that weather occurs regardless of the population size. True ecological regulation requires a feedback loop, forces that change intensity as the population grows. But because local weather is erratic and indifferent to density, it can limit a population without ever truly regulating it. The true regulators of an ecosystem are density-dependent factors. These are limiting forces that escalate in severity precisely as the population becomes more crowded. When too many individuals of the same species pack into a tightly defined area, intraspecific competition kicks in. Organisms struggle against each other for dwindling food supplies and physical space, which naturally causes birth rates to drop and death rates to surge. Sometimes the environment itself turns hostile due to the population's own biological processes. In yeast fermentation, for example, the yeast cells produce alcohol as waste. As the population multiplies, the toxic alcohol builds up in the closed space until it becomes lethal, effectively suffocating their own growth. Add high-density transmission of disease and parasites, along with predators that preferentially hunt abundant prey, and the expanding population inevitably hits a wall. We can see this wall on our chart. The combination of these density-dependent factors creates a hard, invisible ceiling known as the carrying capacity. This horizontal line marks the point where a species' biological potential is finally checked by ecological reality. A population resting at its carrying capacity exists in a state of constant high-stakes negotiation. It represents a precise equilibrium point where the drive to reproduce is exactly offset by environmental resistance. This tension sparks an ongoing evolutionary arms race. To survive density-dependent predation, prey species evolve powerful defenses, like this rough-skinned newt, which produces a highly lethal neurotoxin. In response, their predators, like the common garter snake, continually co-evolve genetic resistance to those exact toxins, ensuring they maintain their food supply in a crowded habitat. Conservationists rely on this exact ecological ledger of births, deaths, and limiting factors. By analyzing these dynamics, they calculate the minimum viable population, the absolute baseline number of individuals required to save a threatened species, like the grizzly bear, from slipping below the threshold of recovery. Which leaves an uncomfortable question. What do these unbending ecological laws mean for the human population? Right now, we are in the midst of a massive demographic transition. There are two main ways to look at our trajectory. The neo-Malthusian perspective, rooted in the early demographic theories of Thomas Malthus, argues that humanity is riding a dangerous exponential curve. In this view, we are destined to eventually crash into a density-dependent wall of famine, disease, and severe resource depletion. On the other side is the cornucopian view. This perspective argues that human technology and agricultural innovation allow us to continually raise our own carrying capacity, bypassing the natural limiting factors that would otherwise stall our growth. Ecology provides the cold mathematical framework for survival on a finite planet, but it is ultimately up to humanity to decide which trajectory our own population curve will follow.